This is Jim Cason with Riverbend Fellowship in Riverbend, North Carolina. This is a special service for Thanksgiving Eve and Thanksgiving of the year 2020, which is the 399th Thanksgiving since the first one in 1621. 400 years ago, the Mayflower landed in the United States. Now, some months ago, I started tracing family tree back through Ancestry, and one of the things I've done in particular is to look for people in my family tree that were godly men and women. And I found a number of them, including Samuel Cason on my father's side, who was an early leader in the Church of Christ, and he was known to walk as far as 15 or 20 miles just to preach at a church. But the one in particular right now that's relevant to Thanksgiving is Elder William Brewster, born in 1567 in England. William Brewster was my 10th great-great-grandfather on my paternal grandmother's side of the family. His particular thing of note is that he came over with his wife and a couple of his kids on the Mayflower. And he was the spiritual leader of the Plymouth colony in New England. He died in April 1644 at the age of around 80, which was a pretty good age at that point in time. And this man exemplifies Christ and Christianity and being willing to suffer to do the right thing and to do the godly thing. He started his early life off at Scrooby in Nottinghamshire. His parents and grandparents were fairly high up. His father was the post of Scrooby, of the mansion house. And that post does not mean like a post office we have now. The early British post was strictly to handle official mail for the king and other high up officials. And really, I think your primary duty was to provide food and shelter and fresh horses for the riders that were going around to take the mail. But born there in Nottinghamshire, and that's where Nottingham is, where he was born is within a few miles of the famous Sherwood Forest. And he grew up in the Church of England at that time, which Henry VIII had separated the English Church and declared the Archbishop of Canterbury as being their spiritual leader as opposed to the Pope. And there was a little bit of difference there, though. The kings and queens of that day considered themselves as being the total leader. If the Archbishop said something they didn't like, they could replace the Archbishop, in other words. But he was pretty well high up during his early part of his life and was educated at Cambridge. We know that he became an assistant to one of the British Secretaries of State and a British ambassador and made a couple of trips to Holland, which were to prove providential later in his life. But he began a separatist. While he was at Peterhouse College in Cambridge, in 1583, he became the personal secretary to William Davidson, an Elizabethan diplomat. This was Elizabeth I. And because of disillusionment with diplomatic and court life, and because of his father's illness, he returned to Scrooby in 1589. And from 1590 until September 1607, he did hold the position of post or postmaster, responsible for the relays of horses on the post road, having previously for a time assisted his father in that office. About 1602, rather on the down low, his neighbors began to assemble for worship at his home, the Manor House, and in 1606 he joined them in organizing the Separatist Church of Scrooby. Now, we don't quite fully understand all the connotation of religious freedom, and we really don't understand why our Constitutional Bill of Rights is so important. In the United States of America, we have no king. Christians have no king except God and Jesus, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. But back in that day, the kings and queens of that day, which was the time of Elizabeth I and the time of James I, they insisted that no other worship could be permitted except the worship of the Anglican Church. There was a short time during which the Catholic Church reigned supreme after that, but that didn't last very long, and you don't fully understand it until you find out that you were commanded by law to go to church. Now, did that mean you had to believe? No, but you better go through the motions. The Elizabethan so-called recusancy laws were established in the 1559 Act of Uniformity of Common Prayer and Administration of the Sacrament. Attendance at church became compulsory, and non-attendance was punishable by a fine or imprisonment. Now, this religious settlement was passed by Parliament on 29 April 1559, and the Elizabethan prayer book was first used in June 24, 1559. And any people that held or attended private masses, in other words, if you were still on the down low acting as a Catholic, you were punished by imprisonment, or worse. It wasn't a terrible fine originally. The recusants were fined 12 shillings for non-attendance of church. But these laws became harsher and harsher, and eventually to a massive £20 a month. Non-payment of the fines resulted in imprisonment, and Elder Brewster was imprisoned several times for lengthy periods. Now, 12 shillings doesn't sound like too much to us today, but let's kind of look at how severe those fines were. In the British coin system at the time, 12 pence made 1 shilling, so the initial fine was 144 pence. And that's the word that the King James Version translates penny. But I've got to go a little further on this. 20 shillings make a pound, and a gold coin of that amount was called a sovereign. And a penny was not like our American pennies. It wasn't a copper coin or copper alloy. It was a silver coin that was worth 1 pence, but it was not called by that name. One of the common trading amounts of that time was called a farthing, and it was a quarter of a penny. In fact, all the lower coins were made of silver at that time, but you don't fully get the message on that until you find out that a typical household servant's annual salary was between £2 and £5 a year. In other words, this was a tremendous amount of money. Now, going back to the story of Brewster, Brewster and John Robinson led the Puritan migration to Amsterdam in 1608. They left England seeking religious freedom. And they didn't get along super well in Amsterdam. Of course, you're going over to a country that has a foreign language, foreign customs. They're already established with their trading and everything, and you've got to find something to do to make a living there. And one of the reasons with Amsterdam was the people's lax morals. They moved to Leiden, which is about 30 miles from Amsterdam, in 1609. And Leiden was the center of a famous university which still exists to this day. And Robinson was the pastor over there in Holland. But Leiden, Brewster, was chosen to be the ruling elder of the congregation. Now, elder there is a different office from deacon. They also had deacons. This is more scriptural in that. An elder of the congregation was a spiritual leader, perhaps not ordained as a pastor, but spiritual leader. And a ruling elder, that really meant ruling. You were the guy if somebody was doing something that they weren't supposed to be doing that was bringing shame to the church. You were the one that was supposed to call them out on it. Now, while in Holland, he made his living by teaching English. He got along with a partner of Thomas Brewer and secretly printed books for sale. And some of those were carried into England, where they were banned by the English government because they promoted this Puritan concept of worship. Now, what is this concept of worship? there have been quite a few movements down through the centuries to re-purify the church. In fact, the Protestant Reformation by Martin Luther was led with the idea of purifying, and Luther did not originally intend to come up with a completely separate church. His original idea was to get rid of some of the excesses that had accumulated the rules from man. It's just like in ancient times, the Jews kept on making more and more rules. They got books and books and books of them instead of just the 5 books that had 2 books that were mostly law. So they got thousands and thousands of little regulations, and this happened over the centuries in all the different churches. You got pomp and circumstances, got to wear special clothes, have special hats, have gold fringes and gold crosses and this, that, and the other, and people got to bow down to you and kiss your ring and all that kind of stuff. Well, there's no scriptural foundation for that. Jesus Christ taught that if you want to be in the kingdom of heaven, you get in the kingdom of heaven by serving others, not by ruling over others. So anyhow, the government didn't like this, and in 1619, Brewster and Brewer's type was seized. He was arrested by the authorities of the University of Leyden, who were acting at the insistence of the British ambassador, Sir Dudley Carleton. And Brewster, however, did escape, and in the same year with Robert Cushman obtained in London, this had to be a God thing, on behalf of the Associates a land patent from the Virginia Company, which would have given them permission to go into the Virginia area, which was a lot bigger then than it is currently. It extended pretty far up, not quite as far as Massachusetts, but pretty far up. And Brewster accompanied the first group of pilgrims to the Mayflower in 1620. They did have 2 ships that were going, but the other ship proved to be not seaworthy, so some of the people had to stay there until later and come on a later one, including some of Brewster's children. But he was also the only university-trained member of the Plymouth community, so he was the real leader of the church. As the senior elder, he dominated the formulation of the doctrines and the worships and the practices. He was not a magistrate by virtue of his close association with William Bradford, who was the second governor, and the first governor died within a few months, the one that the English had appointed. He played a major role in civil as well as religious affairs, and he, by the way, was offered the position of governor and turned it down because it was his feeling that if he was going to lead the people spiritually, then he should not be also the civil leader. Looking at Bradford, Bradford was born in 1589 in Austerfield, which is about 3 miles from Scrooby. This is a noteworthy place, by the way, Austerfield. King Eifrith of England defied Rome and the Pope way back in the 700s. And as I mentioned, both of these locations are near Sherwood Forest. And we won't go further on Sherwood Forest. That's not really relevant. Then there was another leader that was the military leader, Myles Standish. He's one of the names that most people that have studied any history at all over here are familiar with. He's thought to have been born in Duxbury Hall in Lancashire, and he was a lieutenant in Queen Elizabeth I's army. He was stationed in Holland. His first wife was a lady named Rose, and she died during that first winter. About 50% of the people after they arrived in Plymouth passed during that first harsh winter. And Brewster did not write a whole lot about himself, so the sayings that I have of Elder Brewster were really mostly recorded by Bradford, who wrote a voluminous amount of stuff, in particular the history of Plymouth Plantation, and from Ashbel Steele's book, 500 and some page book, Chief of the Pilgrims. It's a long but fascinating reading if you ever decide that you want to take a chance on it, going through it. Anyhow, continuing along a bit more with the history, back in 1608, after they agreed to separate from the Church of England, the separatists of the Scrooby congregation covenanted together to form a church, and they shook off the yoke of anti-Christian bondage, and as ye Lord's free people, joined themselves by a covenant of the Lord into a church estate, in ye fellowship of ye gospel, to walk in all his ways, made none or to be made known unto them according to their best endeavors, whatsoever it should cost them, the Lord assisting them. And friend, it cost them a bunch. The King James Bible had not yet been produced. Most likely the scripture they used would be the Geneva Bible of 1599, and the quotations that I'm using here are from that version. One of the slang terms that they were called was Brownist. It was a derogatory term, very prejudicial. It was referred to one of the first church leaders that broke away from the Anglican Church. Brown was taking an extreme stance on it, and he wanted absolute total separation from the Anglicans and anything to have to do with them. These people, they just wanted the ability to worship on their own. And their basic concept on this, and the concept of the whole Puritan movement, is if it is not traceable to Holy Scripture, it should not be a part of our worship. The Anglican Church had gone so far, and then they stopped. And pomp and a lot of other things of man had become common. These people had persecution, mental, financial, physical trials and privations that they went through for many years, and all they were really seeking to do was to worship God in what they felt was a correct manner. So they left England. They first settled in Amsterdam, then they moved to nearby Leiden. They desired to leave Holland for several reasons. Now, one of the reasons was because of they knew with their kids that they would gradually be assimilated into the population of the Netherlands, and those people, for the most part, were not really highly religious. There were some that were, but most of them weren't. But there was another reason. Spain had attacked Holland a while earlier. In fact, England had helped Holland on that. But there had been a peace treaty signed for 12 years, and that treaty was about to expire, and they feared that the Spanish would come back with a vengeance and that they would resume the Spanish Inquisition, and they knew that was not going to work well for them. So before the first ship Speedwell left Holland, they fasted according to the book of Ezra, chapter 8, verse 21, quoting, "And there at the river, by Ahova, I proclaimed a fast, that we might humble ourselves before our God and seek of him a right way for us and for our children and for all our substance." Oh my. That's something for us to emulate right now. Fasting, humbling ourselves before our God, praying for our nation, worshiping him, thinking of God instead of pumpkins. Nothing wrong with pumpkins, but thinking of God first. The particular name of Hebrews chapter 11, verse 9, or chapter 9, verses 13 through 15, is where the name of Pilgrim came from. Quoting that, "All of these died in faith, and they received not the promises, but they saw them afar off and believed them, and received them thankfully, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. And if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they had leisure to have returned. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed of them to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city." Oh, that's just as good now as it was then. Starting off with Abram, he left where he was. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he was following. All these other people that are described in Hebrews as heroes of the faith, some of them got victory and some of them got scourging and death and pain and torture. But all of them were pilgrims because they left where they were, at least spiritually, and they sought a heavenly kingdom instead. Now, before the Atlantic voyage, their pastor at Leyden, John Robinson, who stayed in Holland with the bulk of the 297 that were in the congregation, prayed with them according to Psalm 100. I'm going to quote that now, also from the Geneva version. Sing ye loud unto the Lord, all the earth. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come before him with joyfulness. Know ye that even the Lord is God. He has made us, and not we ourselves. We are his people, and the sheep of his pasture. Enter into his gates with praise, and into his courts with rejoicing. Praise him and bless his name, for the Lord is good, his mercy is everlasting, and his truth is from generation to generation. You know, there's a lot of people that are down this year for Thanksgiving because they're used to big family get-togethers. My family is used to kind of one, and with this coronavirus situation, that's not happening to a large extent. Some areas it's completely prohibited. In other areas, quite honestly, we're not gathering, not just because the government's suggesting that we don't, although they're not absolutely forbidding it, but because we're trying to do what we think God would want done and do it right. But think about it. God is preparing for us a city. Jesus said, there's many mansions, and I go for to prepare you a place. Are you ready to go to that place? I sure am. That place where everything will be just like it ought to be. Now, getting back to the voyage, this was a long, long voyage, longer than they expected. The wind was contrary. This ship, by the way, was a fairly large one at its time. It was a commercial vessel. It was not really designed for passengers. And a large part of the passengers had to sleep actually on deck, which was really kind of rough. The captain of the ship kept it there for a number of months while the people built houses, which was not his obligation, but can you imagine sleeping in the middle of an ice storm in Massachusetts on top of the deck? Makes me cold just to think about it. And before they left the ship to America, the leaders, in particular Bradford, Brewster, and the British appointed governor John Carver, who died in 1621 and was succeeded by Bradford, wrote the Mayflower Compact. Now, this was after they had arrived. They had sent some scouts out. They figured where they were going to go. But some of the people that were on that ship were not part of their movement, and they wanted some form of governmental agreement, partly because they were not exactly where they were supposed to be, and they were still loyal citizens to the king, except in that they wanted to worship as they felt God was leading. They were still loyal in all other matters. Contrary to the Encyclopedia Britannica, which says they were traitors to this day. I just read it a few days ago. I guess one man's traitor is another man's beneficiary. But this Mayflower Compact was a structure of government for the colony. You might could even call this our first constitution over here. We were a British Crown colony, but the Mayflower Compact was the rules of the game, as it were. They landed a whole lot north of Virginia, where their patent, the king's order granting them permission, was located. I'm going to quote that little thing. It's fairly short. In the name of God, Amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, Defender of the Faith, etc., having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our King and country a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these present solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and of one another covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness whereof we have hereunder subscribed our names, Cape Cod, the 11th of November, in the year of the reign of our sovereign Lord King James of England, France, and Ireland, 18th, and of Scotland, 54th, Anno Domini, 1620. Now, they're here. They have a governmental structure that's been set up. They're hitting that first winter. They did find some food. They found Indians were there, a tribe, and over a period of time they made friends with them and signed a peace treaty with them, because contrary to the way many others came over and tried to subjugate the Indians, destroy them, these people tried to work together for the mutual good. But during that first winter, just about half of the colonists had died. It wasn't so much as the starvation. They did find some stuff to eat. I mean, it wasn't really good rations, and when they got there, they weren't in really great shape. Most of them had scurvy, which is very common on long seaboard voyages because you didn't get enough vitamin C. But they had poor housing, like I said, on the decks of the ship until they could hand build structures. Now you think about that. There wasn't any Lowe's, there wasn't any builder's supply, there wasn't any place they could go down and get the lumber and get a contractor to slam a house together in a few days. They had to take that virgin timbers and that virgin forest and cut that stuff down and get enough room inside the woods to put themselves some houses to begin with, and they had to build those things from scratch. It was far colder weather than they were accustomed, and there were diseases, including some they weren't familiar with. Now, why was it colder? Truthfully, they were about at the same latitude. But England is on, it's more like California is here with the Pacific than the Atlantic coast. The Atlantic coast can be raw in the winter. I don't think anybody here hasn't been through nor'easters. And they got to be a lot colder and a lot worse in Massachusetts than they are in North Carolina. They did establish good relationship with the closest native tribe by their strict observance of Christian principles. The natives had become suspicious even because they got there because of bad treatment by trappers and others that had come to the land. Some from Spain, some from France, but these people were different in how they treated the natives, each other, and the land. Elder Brewster, truly a ruling elder, he worked as much as anybody else, including far younger men, as long as he could, as well as leading the Sabbath services, which we're going to get to in a minute, teaching the children part of the time and taking care of his own family. And he was just about 80 when he passed. Now, their church service. This is a quote from a letter that was sent on the 4th of October, 1627, from a man named Isaac de Ratiers to Governor Bradford. And Isaac was not a member of the colony, but he came down here from Europe, was a visitor, describing Plymouth Plantation church and worship. I'm quoting from his letter. In the center, on the cross street, stands the governor's house, before which is a square enclosure upon which 4 pateros. Now, the definition of a patero, it's a small piece of ordnance, now obsolete, worked on swivels, most commonly used on board of ships, where they were mounted on the gunwale and discharged showers of old nails, etc., into hostile boats. In other words, for all practice, it was a small cannon, are mounted so as to flank along the streets. Upon the hill they have a large square house with a flat roof made of thick sawn plank, stayed with oak beams, upon the top of which they have 6 cannons, which shoot iron balls of 4 or 5 pounds and command the surrounding country. In other words, they were preparing for attack from sea or from land, either one. The lower part they also used for their church. Now, when they first got there, they had the whole church outside. Then they kind of put it in different houses as they got them put together, but this was one of the earliest structures they built because they recognized the need for defense. Going back to the letter. The lower part they use for their church, where they preach on Sundays and the usual holidays. They assemble by the beat of a drum, each with his musket or firelock, in front of the captain's door. Notice, these people came armed. 24/7, you did not know when you were going to likely to need those arms. In front of the captain's door, in other words, Myles Standish's door. They have their cloaks on. Yeah, they sure would in that winter. And they place themselves in order, 3 abreast, and are led by a sergeant without beat of drum. In other words, an orderly assembly. Behind comes the governor, which would have been William Bradford, with a long robe. Beside him on the right hand comes the preacher, which is William Brewster, with his cloak on. And on the left hand, the captain with his sidearms and cloak on, and with a small cane in his hand. And so they march in good order, and each sets his arms down near him. Thus they are constantly on their guard night and day. That's the end of the letter. By the way, we know from Bradford's book that Sunday services were held approximately between 9 to noon, and again from 2 till 5 o'clock. And Elder Brewster, by the way, during that, they would sing. They did not sing anything at all except the Psalms. There was no accompaniment except the human voice. They did not use the hymn book that had been made for the Anglican Church, feeling that it was not scriptural. In fact, they also did not celebrate Christmas or Easter because they could find no reason at all in the Bible for doing that. Now, this next part of this is some of the questions and answers that Governor Bradford recorded between the school children and Elder Brewster. The school children were taught largely in their homes, but the elder, being one of the only educated people there, did do some teaching as well in addition to all of his other duties. First question: do you have to be very old before you become an elder of the church? Answer: generally, elders are among the more reverent members of the church, but there's no law prescribing their age. In other words, the position of church elder is not determined by how old you are, but by how spiritual you are. Next one: where do you hold church services, and what's the place like? We do not have a building where the church meets. We've been gathering in one of the members' houses, and on warm days we meet outside. What are your church services like? In the morning on Sunday, the drum is sounded about 8 o'clock. Together we march to wherever we're going to meet, with the governor, Captain Myles Standish, and myself leading the parade. We gather for prayer and reading the Bible and singing the Songs of David. And I give sermons that are about 90 minutes long. Now you think about that, 90-minute long sermons. I've been in some places, by the way, that did sermons that long. I've been in some services that started like 11 o'clock and finished at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But in a lot of our modern churches, the people would have gone home long before that. The morning service lasts about 4 hours altogether. Next question: what kind of discipline does a religious leader have to follow? We follow the rules laid out in the Bible for running our church. What are the topics in your sermons? I preach much on the callings of the true Christians, the dangers and woes of sin, and the tender mercies of our Lord Jesus. He is our Redeemer and the hope of our salvation. How were you treated by the King of England? The king was persuaded by the bishops that we were outlaws in religion. So his men arrested us and even put some of us in jail. We are loyal to the king and respect his civil authority, but we cannot admit him to be the head of the Church of Christ. Amen to that. That, by the way, is the true meaning of the separation of church and state that's referred to in our Constitution. Why didn't you bring your other children on the Mayflower? I didn't bring all my children because there wasn't enough room on the Mayflower. When the Speedwell had to stay back in England, some of us had to leave family members behind. I chose to bring my 2 littlest children, Wrestling and Love. Yes, that was their first names. Wrestling was a boy, Love was a girl. My older children, the son Jonathan and the daughters Patience and Fear, returned to Holland and are living with our minister. I love this question. What do you do in your spare time? I don't have any. I'm so busy preparing my sermons, raising my children, and working my farms that I have no spare time. How many people live at Plymouth Plantation? There are about 50 people living in town. Most are young adult men. What kind of food do you eat? We are planting both our English crops and many strange native corns and beans and pompions. We hope to have more livestock to slaughter, but the hunting and fishing are very good. How do you store and preserve food for the cold winter months? Most meats, especially fish and pork, are salted. Some things are pickled and others are dried, such as grains and onions. What kind of clothing do you wear? We continue to dress ourselves as well as we can as English men and women. Our clothes are chiefly of wool and linen. Hats and cloaks are necessary against the wild weathers of this land. Why do Pilgrim men always wear very dark clothing? You ever notice the pictures of them? They look so dreary and unsatisfactory and unhappy. Well, this was his official answer from somebody that was there. We don't always wear dark clothing. Many people have colorful clothing, reds and oranges and blues. Do you have medicine? Yes. Samuel Fuller, our surgeon, takes good care of our health. He has surgeon's books, herbal remedies, and tools for pulling teeth, letting blood, and mending bones. Bloodletting is a particular skill of his. Let that sink in a little bit. That was state of the art at that time, even in England and Germany and other places. Do you pay for things with money? What currency do you use? We trade with the native peoples, but we do not exchange money with them. In England, we would use pounds and shilling and pence. Here, all of our goods are purchased from merchants. Why did the Pilgrims build a palisade or barrier surrounding Plymouth? Though our Poconé neighbors are friendly, we were threatened by other natives who live further off. We must also fear our ancient foes, the French and the Spaniards. Now comes the part that all the kiddies are waiting for, and all the folks that just love to eat at Thanksgiving. You ever wondered if there really was turkey with Thanksgiving? I'm going to get the answer to that. What were some of the foods you saw at the Thanksgiving feast? There were wild turkeys, goose, duck, lobster, fish of many different kinds, venison brought by the natives, good cheeses, and puddings made out of corn. It's, by the way, very unlikely that potatoes were there because they were not native to North America. They were brought in later. And wild turkey tasted like the turkeys we eat, about like venison tastes like beef. There's a considerable difference. No pumpkin pie because of lack of sugar. That was not something they could bring along with them. They didn't have a way of making it right then. How many Indians were present at the feast? There were more natives than colonists at the feast. We were about 50 and they were more than 100. Why was the Thanksgiving feast special to you? Our harvest feast came after we had goodly yield from our plantings. For 3 days we feasted with our Poconé neighbors. It was a civil harvest feast. Our religious Thanksgivings are daily observances of the church, which we could never celebrate with the Indians who were not Christians. Do you celebrate any holidays besides Thanksgiving? We consider the only holy day to be Sunday. We do not celebrate Easter or Christmas because that cannot be found in the Bible. Jesus did not tell us the day he was born. That's the answer of those questions that were made directly to my ancestor. In further reading from the book on the leader of the Pilgrims, I find the actual place in the Bible that they found the authority for the Thanksgiving feast was the one Jewish feast that they were commanded to share with the Gentiles. That was what we would call a harvest feast or harvest festival. That was the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Tabernacles, which was recently done this year, a month or two ago, and is still being celebrated by Jews all over the world. But just think, when you sit down Thanksgiving Day with what family you have together, and you eat whatever you're going to eat, whether it be a huge Thanksgiving meal like some have had during times, or if it's something more simple, or if it's something that most people don't even think about as a Thanksgiving meal, The primary attitude that we as Christians should have is being thankful to our God for all that He has done for us, that He's doing for us, for saving us to begin with, because we were definitely not worth it, but Jesus thought we were. All lives matter. No special group. All lives matter to a Christian, because either no lives matter or all lives matter. And when you sit down, if you have an opportunity to bless somebody else that's not as fortunate as you, do it. If you have an opportunity afterward or any other time, do it. And be that hand and feet of Jesus that the church is supposed to be. God bless you.